And I'm gonna mute everybody, so just be prepared.
Hello, hello, welcome. Welcome to Episcopal Women's History Project Lenten series. We will give a minute until others can join us. All right, I think we are ready. Um, Everyone, welcome to the first week of Episcopal Women's History Project Lenten series. This is one of the 6 series that is planned. Today we are welcoming the Reverend Dr. Molly James, Interim Executive Officer and Secretary of General Convention. She's going to talk to us about women in the church, past and present. Before I introduce her to you, let us start the session with Woman's Prayer. It will be shared on the screen in a minute. Let us pray. O God, creator of all life, bless the unsung lives of countless Christian women in every century who were your hands and feet, who kept alive your compassionate presence by feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, clothing the naked, comforting the sad, praying and petitioning, strengthening those in prison, teaching the stories, sewing and singing, weeping and rejoicing. Grant us the wisdom to discern our ministries in this day as our foremothers found theirs. Lead us in new and timeless forms of discipleship, and let us joyfully find our place in this procession of praise offering our varied gifts and voices together with them and Mary, the mother of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you. Could I be spotlighted? Thank you. Hello, welcome. My name is Yang Kim. I am a clergy in the Diocese of New York, currently serving as priest for Sacramental Life and Membership at Trinity Church, New York. I am new-ish president of Episcopal Women's History Project, and here we are joined by many of our board members, and we all welcome you to this wonderful series that we have done for many, many years. Please know that this is getting recorded and our video will be shared on our YouTube channel, which Liz would also put in the chat for you to subscribe to, and you will be able to see the videos. Someone also asked if you could please send us the prayer. The prayer can be uploaded in the chat. Um, Without further ado, I would like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Molly James. She's an interim executive officer and secretary of General Convention. Molly currently serves as the interim executive officer of General Convention for the Episcopal Church. She holds a PhD in theology from the University of Exeter, UK, a Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School, and Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Tufts University. She grew up in Maine and was ordained as a priest in 2005. She has served on the bishop's staff in Connecticut as a parish priest and a hospital chaplain, as well as an adjunct professor focusing on ethics and pastoral care. Her doctoral research focused on suffering and grief. Her work with Joyful Acceptance, maybe, was published in 2013 by With and Stock. Molly previously served as co-chair of Young Clergywoman International, which is an ecumenical organization of clergywomen under 40, which I was a member of a while ago, and as a board member for the Society of Scholar Priests. She is currently co-chair of the Faith Communities Today Research Consortium, a board member for the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies, and the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance. She has 2 children and loves cooking, reading, travel, and spending time in the splendor of God's creation. So please welcome Molly, and I will give you the microphone.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint slides here. One moment. There we go. Very glad to be here and have this conversation with you all today. And so I was mentioning to our leadership here, I prefer to teach seminars rather than lecture classes. So I am very glad to have live engagement with our material today. So feel free to ask questions during the course of things, and there will be plenty of time as well for questions at the end. So I'm going to look, as the title says, at some history of women in leadership in the Episcopal Church, and particularly sort of in governance, and also look at sort of some current data around women in the church. And my colleague Matthew Price, who is the Vice President of Research at Church Pension Group, was not able to be with me, but he did share his slides. And those of you who were perhaps at EPN or have been at other things know that Matthew and I often do some version of our data presentations together. And so we are pretty able to talk about each other's slides. So you may have questions about Matthew's slides that I can't answer, and I do know a fair amount, and I will certainly do my best. So it will be a mixture of data today. So let us begin. So I always start my slides with a map because I like to remind everyone, even though lots of us are Episcopal Church experts in this room, just how geographically diverse the Episcopal Church is, that we are all the way west in Taiwan, Guam, and Hawaii, and Alaska. We go all the way east into Europe. Our furthest east congregation is in Tbilisi, Georgia. And then we have quite a lot of congregations in the Caribbean, in Central and South America. So and then of course, it's worth noting that the bulk of our congregations are here in the United States. And I always think it's for cultural context, worth noting that we are concentrated in the South and the East. All right, so we're going to look at a little bit of history, particularly from the governance side. Obviously, General Convention is very important to me and the work of my office. So as you can see from the seal in the upper right-hand corner, the first General Convention was in 1785. I'll offer you a funny note. I was signing the Episcopal Church up for a business account with something, and it asked for the year your corporation started, and I tried to put in 1785, and it wouldn't let me put in a date before 1800. So I had to use the date that we became the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. Worth noting, right? Why is the House of Deputies always referred to as the senior house? Because they were there first. Bishops didn't participate in General Convention until 1789. The first women's triennial gathering that happened alongside General Convention was in 1874, so almost about 90 years after the first General Convention. The canon that permitted women to become deaconesses was approved in 1889. I would guess if, for those of you who are women's history experts in the Episcopal Church, you are familiar with the book by Mary Donovan, A Different Call. She looks especially at the history of women in the Episcopal Church. And I think this is a notable quote. Between 1850 and 1920, the work of its women had enabled the Episcopal Church to claim the social gospel as its own. Although the majority of the women who established the social service ministries never sought credit for their labors, their work had a lasting effect on the church that they served. And if you're not familiar with that book, I highly recommend it. So a little more history. Note that Julia Chester Emery's remarkable tenure of 40 years as the secretary of the Women's Auxiliary. Then between 1889 and 1919, the predecessor to what is now the United Thank Offering gave away over $2 million, which would be about $50 million or so in today's money. So noting how much women's work and finances supported the ministry across the church, especially the work of missionaries. In 1916, the General Convention took the first vote about whether or not women could be deputies. You know, your American history, this is in the same era in which, you know, the United States is grappling with the question of whether or not women would have the right to vote in the secular world and civic society. And quite notably, in 1919, men was inserted into the canons, like where it just said lay or something. It would go in and say lay men, to make it very clear that there was no, that they were always referring to men. They added men back in more places in the canons in 1919. And women didn't join the National Council, which is now the Executive Council or the board of the Episcopal Church, the corporate board of the Episcopal Church. Didn't join that until 1934. And then if we're looking still at some history from the House of Deputies, that had its first lay president, so non-clergy president in 1946. We didn't have women deputies until 1970. So there were the first positions of women in truly in the leadership structures of the whole Episcopal Church was in the 1930s there. In Executive Council, women didn't become deputies of General Convention until 1970. The first women were ordained to the priesthood in 1974. The first president of color in the House of Deputies was in 1976, the year the canons were changed to permit the women's ordination to the priesthood. Our first woman bishop in the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion was ordained in 1989, so 200 years after the first General Convention with bishops. First lay woman president of the House of Deputies was in 1991. The first woman clergy president was in 2012. And in 2022, the House of Deputies was led by 2 women of color, both as president and as vice president. So where are we now in terms of the demographics of the church? One of the things that we do, it was mentioned in my bio, is I work with an organization called the Faith Communities Today Research Consortium. And so we participate in a number of surveys alongside that. And one of the things that's wonderful about those surveys is they ask questions that we don't normally ask on a parochial report. So I couldn't give you any gender statistics from our parochial report because they aren't asked there. But the fact survey does ask that. And we had a pretty decent sample of what was the demographic, a pretty decent sample of congregations across the church complete that survey. And so some interesting sort of demographic facts about the Episcopal Church in this context, perhaps most meaningful, what I would guess most of us might think was true. It's always nice to have data confirm what we think might be true, which is that the Episcopal Church is majority female. There are more women in the church than men. Not surprisingly also, right, we are one of the most highly educated highly educated faith traditions. They're only, I think the Hindu and Jewish traditions are generally even more highly educated than we are as a whole. Interesting that, you know, small percentage of people knew, lots of volunteering at congregations. We are pretty well off, and most people live close to the churches they attend. We are not necessarily, though, a majority of folks who are lifelong Episcopalians. Most of us are American born, not as many with who are immigrants or persons with special needs, and small percentage on the LGBTQ side. We could certainly do more data and research on that. Matthew does have, and I'll get to it later, Matthew does have good data on the clergy front on that side. The other piece that I think is just wonderful to note about our congregations, and we could have a fascinating conversation perhaps about whether or not we think that these answers are because our congregations are majority female, but asked about what are the sources of pride in congregations, and the themes that emerge from that. And I think it's worth noting that only the outreach ministries, right, is a program. Nobody talked about their building. They talked about the intangible characteristics of Christian community wherever it is gathered, the sense of community, a feeling of love, hospitality, the faith, the diversity of communities, that is really what mattered to folks. And now I'm going to pause and do a little bit of live sharing from a tool on our website. So hold on one moment. Okay. So, oops, wrong. Hang on. Sorry, wrong. Hold on, wrong window of Google Chrome. Hang on one second. Okay, there we go. All right. So, that first bit I showed you is a useful tool for exploring the data of congregations. What I wanted to show you here is another tool that's on the Episcopal Church's website, that's underneath the area of research and statistics in Explore Your Neighborhood. There is a tool here to look much more at demographic and census data in particular. Now, there isn't a whole lot of necessarily of gender data in the census, but I do think there are some pieces here that's just, I hope I'll highlight this as a tool for you to get to know the neighborhood around your congregation. So we can look at age data. So I'm going to zoom way into the Episcopal Church Center area in New York, since that's the one location we all hold in common. And so there's here we go. There's the island of Manhattan. You can see how the demographics that notably perhaps that the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn are generally younger than the middle of Manhattan and most of some of Queens and northern Long Island there. The other pieces, interesting pieces we can look at, there is some gender identity data from in this tool. And so this is looking at gender identity from the percentage of adults who are LGBTQIA+ at a state level. So you can see the more purple, the higher, the more blue or the fainter, the lower. So interesting to see those kinds of numbers across the state. I also think it's very worth always important to talk about intersectionality and the shared identities and things like that. There's some remarkable research out of the University of Richmond about the history of redlining. And so you can, if you live in an area, New York City would be one of them, where there was historic redlining, you can see how that happened. And so the green areas are the far more affluent ones moving, and then and historically white areas, and then moving through the other grades and as you can see, red, which is where we get the name redlining, historically redlining, which was the areas that were largely for people of color. So I will share this the link to this in the chat for you all, and I hope it would be a tool that you all might make use of for your own congregations or even just your own neighborhood. So now I will go back to our slides. So there's the neighborhood tool. And now I will talk a little bit about Matthew's data on the current state of clergy in the Episcopal Church and where the gender balance is. So as I noted, right, we've been ordaining women as deacons. Well, they were originally called deaconesses, of course, since the late 1800s. We've been ordaining women as priests since, the first in 1974 and officially since 1976. So that was a while ago, and yet we still have this gender imbalance across ministry, right? We still have majority male priests, and this is active clergy. This isn't all clergy. If it were all clergy, the statistics would be even more male, of course, because plenty of retired clergy who were ordained before women were priests would be in the system. But interestingly, the diaconate remains, more than 100 years later, still very strongly female. And the House of Bishops is even more strongly male, although that has shifted in recent years, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. Of course, the world of gender identity is broader than just the binary male-female, and so worth noting, and this is self-reported from clergy. So we're still majority male, 42% female, and we have 2% who are multiple genders, non-binary or self-described. Then looking at the ordinations, receptions, and consecrations by gender between 2013 and 2023, still more men than women in the priesthood, still more women than men in the diaconate. We're getting we're getting closer there to balance in the priesthood, and we've made some significant progress over in terms of women in the House of Bishops. Now, this is really worth noting. As I mentioned, right, the first woman bishop, Barbara Harris, was ordained in 1989. In the subsequent 25 years, think about that, it's 25 years, only 9% of the bishop consecrations were female. 9% of the bishop consecrations were female. And there's well over 100 bishops in the House of Bishops. Although, but then look at the shift from 2016 to 2023, 43% of the bishop consecrations were female. So I think it's very worth noting, Matthew often likes to highlight how it is actually possible for the church to change in a relatively short period of time. We often talk about change in the church being something that happens very slowly, and it's really worth noting here that it actually can happen quite quickly. In a mere 7 years, we went from the number of bishop consecrations, having previously 9% in the first 25 years, and then in the subsequent 7, it was 43%. So there's some big shifts in the demographics of the House of Bishops in recent years. And then looking at the overall distribution of clergy by gender, by type. In terms of the majority of clergy are still solo rectors, few assistants, some in specialty ministry. So that would be people who are in chaplaincy, people who work on diocesan staff, people like me who work for the churchwide level. Senior rector means they are a rector with other clergy on staff. So very few of those. Most of our congregations have solo rectors. And then 3% of our clergy are bishops. Worth noting here, what you perhaps might expect to be still true in the church is that there are more part-time women clergy than part-time male clergy. And of course, there is also a gender pay gap still in the Episcopal Church. And Matt, if you want to dig into that data, I will put another link in the chat in a moment. Matthew's research also includes compensation reports, and there is a great deal there about the sort of details of how pay breaks down across the church, particularly by geography as well as by gender. And then here noting that's also where the dynamics are in terms of for people of color, and then for LGBTQ identities as well. And just worth noting that the balance is a little bit better, interestingly, the gender balance is a little bit better for in terms of slightly more balance between male and female in the non-parochial model, those of course not including bishops. So non-parochial clergy would be, again, those of us in sort of specialty ministries who's serving on diocesan staff, serving on church-wide staff, serving in school settings, chaplaincy settings, etc. Although we are still quite a majority white church, and that is reflected in our clergy as well. And again, a majority heterosexual church as well. I do think this is worth noting. Some of you will have perhaps seen this slide last week at EPN, but that if we're talking about the senior rector position, right? So, and not about age, senior not being about age, but about being a rector who has other clergy reporting to them. So in a congregation of multiple clergies, we have not balanced the gender there. That is, significantly more male. That role is significantly more male than the overall balance of male and female priests in the Episcopal Church. And then also significantly more white than the clergy overall. And a little more balanced on the LGBTQ front, but still not quite as balanced on all fronts as we could be. So I will note these additional pieces for you. So and then I will pull those here. I'll put those links into the chat as well. And that last one with the CPG link is where you can also find Matthew's presentation, particularly about women and clergy women's salaries and how there is indeed still, sadly, a gender pay gap in the Episcopal Church. So that's a quick whirlwind tour of some historical and current data about, particularly about demographics. I would be glad now to engage with any questions that you all might have, and glad to engage in a conversation. I know this is also a room full of expert women in the Episcopal Church, so glad to hear your perspectives on what I've presented and sort of the broader themes of women in the history of the Episcopal Church.
Molly, maybe to get us started, can you tell us maybe the top 2 or 3 things that you found as you started this work to be the most concerning to you?
Great question. I would say, I think I had known that piece about, I knew when that it, took us almost a couple hundred years to bring women into the House of Deputies, the General Convention, and the leadership, and the pieces there, and that, and somehow I knew the stories of, Julia Chester Emery and the women's leadership, particularly the women's auxiliary and things, and etc. But I hadn't realized quite how restrictive things were in keeping women out of leadership for so many years, right? That they'd started voting on the possibility of women having the ability to be representing their diocese at General Convention in 1916. And it took so many more decades. And I think the piece that's still concerning, on the one hand, I can look at this and I can look at the historical perspective and I can rejoice at how far we have come, right? And I rejoice, I was born in 1980. So right, there have been women priests my entire life. The bishop who ordained me was a woman. There's, we've made such remarkable progress, and yet the strains of our history are still there. And as Matthew's data bears out, we haven't gotten to equality yet in terms of positions, in terms of sort of just balance in the church, in terms of ordinations overall, active clergy overall, and we certainly haven't gotten there yet in terms of pay. And I see Joan has noted in the chat here a very important caveat, which is that not every diocese in the Episcopal Church was ordaining LGBTQ people for as long as it was possible to do so in the Episcopal Church. And so it wasn't until after 2008 that was true. So we have there's some catching up to do across the church on that front.
There's also catching up just on women, because in fact, over half the diocese did not immediately begin to ordain women. And it was a very slow process over about 20 years where all the dioceses got in line. So it's not surprising still that the numbers are not as balanced.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a great point, Joan. Thank you. Yes. And indeed, in even, in the early 2000s when I was in seminary, there were still places in the church that really weren't ordaining women. And certainly places now that, still have all male slates for the episcopacy. There is definitely room for growth on that front, and important to highlight the progress. And as Joan, as you noted, right, important to note that just because in 1976, right, that we passed those canons that said, that gender would not be a barrier to ordination, that didn't change things overnight by any means. No. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question in chat. How does the percentage of women priests compare to female ministers in other denominations? I don't have those numbers right exactly across the top of my head. Of course, one could have fun and say, well, we have lots more than the Roman Catholics. But I would say we were a little behind in terms of some of the mainline. The rest of the mainline started ordaining women earlier than we did. So I would say, would guess that they're probably a bit more balanced, but it's still a challenge. As was mentioned, I was chair for a number of years of the Young Clergy Women International. I am just like Yang no longer because I am an alum now. I'm over 40. But part of the reason that organization was founded, and it was largely made up of, mainline Protestant women clergy, was because it was still, even in the early 2000s when it was founded, it was still a real struggle, and lots of people were serving in congregations where they were the first woman and those pieces. So I would say, it's pretty universal. I don't have the exact numbers, but I would say the experience of it being challenging to be a woman clergy person is pretty universal across the main line, even, recently. There's another question in chat here. What was the vote to ordain women for or against? So in 1973, General Convention considered it, and they did not pass the ordination of women. So the ordination of the Philadelphia 11 in 1974 was what's known as irregular, and was, sort of outside the bounds of the rules at the time. And so it wasn't until 1976 that General Convention did actually approve and regularize the ordination of those women who'd been ordained in 1974. Are some of the differences between male versus female regional? Yeah, yes, I would think so. I'd have to look a little bit more at that data, but I would guess that from some of the other pieces I've looked at, that there definitely are regional differences on that front for sure. Yeah, if we had time, Joan and I could probably color a map together about which ones, which dioceses took longer to ordain women and or LGBTQ people in sort of historically there. So there definitely are regional differences, and up until recently, there were still a few dioceses that took a very long time to ordain women.
Well, not only not ordain them, but be willing to place them in a parish, because many of them, women would transfer into or want to transfer into a diocese, and there was at least one bishop who was not accepting them, and then even if you were accepted, there was just never any place for you.
Yes, right. That is very true. On the positive end of that, when Bishop Arthur Walmsley, who was the Bishop of Connecticut in the late 1970s and early through the 80s in Connecticut, when he died a few years ago, I was in the clergy procession at his funeral behind some senior women clergy in the Diocese of Connecticut, and they were talking about how he had, in that time, right, shortly after women were ordained, he required congregations to interview, when they were searching for a priest, he required them to interview a woman, because he firmly believed, and these women said, you know, it was transformational in their experience, that right, if they just got in the room and they started getting to know women and they started getting things, it would change. And he really did do, you know, there's an instance of a man using his power and authority to, you know, support the uplifting of women. And, you know, there were many women, you know, who'd been serving in Connecticut for decades by the time I came here. And so I do think, so there were some good instances of bishops supporting to counter those numerous and challenging stories of places where women were not welcome. Will there be more women theologians in the Episcopal Church with time? Well, I hope so. Of course, I always hope there are more women and more theologians in the church, because I am both of those things. So yes, I certainly hope so. I don't know the current statistics of you know, women going into academia, but or getting, you know, degrees in that, but hopefully you could certainly also make a case that all women clergy are theologians as well. So, and we certainly have far more women clergy now than we used to. Although Matthew did note to me when we were corresponding about these slides that, you know, we are seeing a slow sort of tapering of ordinations in terms of the overall total of ordinations in the Episcopal Church is decreased a little bit in recent years. And the percentage balance in that of males and females is holding steady. So overall, that does actually mean we are ordaining less, fewer women than we had been previously, just, you know, raw numbers. Are you seeing any emerging geographic pockets of women clergy and women bishops being ordained? I mean, to a certain extent, you know, as noted, there are some geographic pockets where, you know, the bishop slates are still all male. If you're reading your Episcopal News Service, you saw one come out for the Diocese of Dallas recently that was all male, which probably didn't surprise anyone, given the history of the Diocese of Dallas. So there's pieces. So yes, there are those pieces. I also think, you know, we have now had also a number of instances of some all-female slates for the episcopacy. And I think, you know, all of us would say, right, the goal going forward would be balanced slates that, you know, are not all one gender or the other. So there, you know, there is, and Matthew and I often talk about this, there's a sort of, from a demographic perspective, there's a pipeline question, right? The House of Bishops, at least particularly racially, is now more diverse than the clergy pool, right? The House of Bishops is more racially diverse than the whole clergy pool, which means the pool of people who feed into the House of Bishops is not as diverse as it currently is. So clearly, in order to continue, you know, we do have some challenges ahead of us in terms of continuing to keep the pool of people who are ordained, particularly in that case to the priesthood, as diverse as possible, in order that it reflects the diversity of the church, and in order to ensure that the House of Bishops stays diverse going forward. We need a diverse cadre of priests from whom to choose our bishops. I think that's the end of the questions in the chat. But if I missed one, somebody let me know. Or other ones. Sandra, tell about your my role. Well, if you were watching the live stream of Executive Council, which I think is a rather small audience, but Katie Sherrod from the Diocese of Texas is the chair of the committee looking at the executive officer position in this interim time of transition. And she described the role of the executive officer as a Picasso painting from his Cubist period, which I loved. I thought that was a fabulous way to describe this role, because there are so many pieces to it. So there's the executive officer of General Convention, there's the secretary piece, there's also historically the secretary of the House of, also the secretary of the House of Deputies, there's the registrar, which is basically all the paperwork that's associated with bishop consecrations. So that's one of my favorite parts of my job, because it means I get to go to the bishop consecrations and do their certificate, which, every bishop comes and puts a wax seal on the certificate of the new bishop being ordained. So they have the wax seal of every bishop who was present at their consecration. So that's a wonderful piece of the job. So that's a lot of fun. Our office, as noted, where we collect all of the parochial report data and diocesan report data. And so we are the repository of lots of congregational and diocesan data. And so have lots of information and understanding of the church as a whole, participate in the other research consortiums that are mentioned, and which allow us a better understanding of life in the Episcopal Church, a fuller understanding than just the parochial report data, and an opportunity to see our data in alongside other denominations as well. Obviously, the Office of General Convention plans General Convention, so that's a big piece of what our office does. And we also plan all the meetings that happen between General Conventions, Executive Councils, standing commissions, task forces, all the various interim bodies that there are. So there's a lot of pieces there. We now also do a lot of work in terms of translation and interpretation of materials, particularly related to meetings, but increasingly so to the rest of the organization as well. So there are lots of pieces. I often say to folks that the thing I love about working in this I love a variety of things about working for the General Convention office. Part of it is the ability to see the breadth and the depth of our church and get to know people across the church, and that's a huge gift. The other piece I love about it is that no 2 days are ever the same. And so it's a real gift to be able to work in all of these different areas and talk with people across the church, get to have such hear from diverse perspectives and engage with the breadth and depth of our church, and not just across the United States, but outside of it as well.
With no other questions, Does anybody have a burning question that they just need to ask? We're going to give one last.
We've got one there. Are funding decisions made based on your data? I hope that will increasingly be true. If you watched, some of Bishop Sean's talks recently, he's also one who loves data and is seeking to have more and more data-driven decision making. And I would sort of encourage to say, you all at congregational level or local level, in diocesan level, you have the ability to make data-driven decisions as well. The tools on our website can certainly help you all do that. There's also a sort of theological toolbox, if you will, for thinking about data and how you might think about data with a vestry or other leadership group, and how you can allow the data both of your own congregational community, what the historical data is for your congregation or community, as well as the, sort of all the demographic data. How is the work of your congregation or other, church-related entity, how is that reflective of and engaging with the needs that are identified in the neighborhood? That demographic tool can tell you things like, how far it is to a grocery store, what's the, what languages do people speak around you, those kinds of things, like at what, poverty level, housing costs, all kinds of, age group. I think the age demographics especially can be really helpful if people are seeking, younger people in their congregation. Well, it's worth knowing, do you actually have a lot of young people in your neighborhood to engage with? And if you don't, then maybe it's worth thinking, structuring your programs differently in a way to engage with the demographics that are around you. So I would certainly encourage, I'm in favor of data-driven decision at all levels of the church. And I would certainly encourage you all to make great use of the tools that are available to be able to do that at the local level, as well as we are striving to do more and more of that at the church-wide level.
It's a comment on the age kinds of things.
Yes.
My parents lived for many years in a retirement community of 15,000 people who were all over 55. And the Episcopal parish that was inside the bounds of that, the priest said that it couldn't possibly survive unless they had children. Now, the older people that were there were, of course, turning over because age does have a limit. And when that hits, there's a new space and somebody who's a more likely 55 is moving in. But this guy could not see beyond to actually what the demographic richness that he had. It was so set on a model.
Right. And by no means, one of the things Matthew and I talk about often is the multiple realities of our church. That there isn't a one size fits all model. There's not one, the data is very diverse. We often look at it, as we have today, in an aggregate, looking at the whole church. But if you break it down by region and size and various things, like, there's a lot of different contexts in our church. And I think it's so important for us to not think there's only one way of doing church. And church is a wonderful intergenerational entity, and maybe one of the few sort of left institutions like that in our society, where you often have intergenerational activity. But that depends on where you're situated. Are you in a place surrounded by, multiple age demographics? Or if you are in, a situation, as you were just describing, of a particular slice of age demographics, and be the best community for that demographic that you can be. And in other entities,
one of the things about
very
that
different. Yeah,
is that one of the other things about that age demographic is that women outnumber men in it.
Yes, that's very true of that.
And that is also part of the difference in those stats that you were showing overall.
Right. Well, yes, why women are a majority in the church. Yeah. we live longer, generally speaking. Sandra asked where that toolkit I mentioned, the theological toolkit, is there. So I've put that link in the chat as well.
Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank you for a really, really fine introduction to all kinds of just some unsettling and some very interesting data. So thank you for that, Molly. I know that was a different kind of dig than what you normally do, so I appreciate the time you took to prepare for that. And I've asked Molly if she would take us out with a little prayer.
Before you do that, would you like to
Yes.
highlight what's coming up next, Sandra? We have
Sure.
a week from today. Let's do our own publicity here.
Okay, good idea, Joan. Next week we have an education for ministry story, which I think people will find very interesting. Rick Brewer and Angela Hawk, who are two of I would say that they are the greatest pool of wisdom about education for ministry that we have available. And Rick is going to tell the story of Angela's work because seldom does her work get described. So I think you'll just enjoy meeting both of them and hearing the story of education for ministry. And then the week following that, I'll just go one more week. We have a young, well, I consider her young, a young Nebraska priest who has recently transitioned and as a rector. And so I think that will be a compelling story. And she's going to give us some of the scriptural references and so forth, and then tell her story. So those are the next 2 weeks of what we've got. Thanks for reminding me to give that plug. So anything else that we need to tell people? All right, Molly, thank you again. And
Welcome, and I have also put my email address in the chat there. So if you all have follow-up questions or challenge accessing any of the online tools or resources that I've mentioned, please feel free to be in touch. So I will close us with the collect for the celebrating Polly Murray as a fellow Yale alum who was, truly such a trailblazer in American society and in the Episcopal Church. And so someone worth honoring her. Liberating God, we thank you for the steadfast courage of your servant, Polly Murray, who fought long and well. Unshackle us from the chains of prejudice and fear, that we may show forth the reconciling love and true freedom which you revealed in your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Wonderful to be with you all. Blessings on your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.